You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Remember that weird time not that long ago when our cities just ground to a halt, when we were confined to our homes, the streets were empty, and COVID-19 had caused a serious medical and social crisis. At the time, it felt like cities weren't really a great place to be. But there was also hope on the horizon of creating something better for everybody on the other side of it. Something cleaner, greener, fairer, and accessible. But has that actually happened? Today on Climate Conversations, we're doing some due diligence on old promises. Hello, I'm Jack Board. Welcome, Liling Tan. Liling, dare I remind you of those dark days of the pandemic? Anything you promised to do back then that you have followed through on till today?
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to leave New York City. I wanted to move either to an outlying land in higher altitude, near reliable water source, do subsistence farming, rear chickens, grow orchards, keep seed vaults. Or the other option was to return to the warm, safe, clean embrace of Singapore. And here I am.
So how's your chicken farming going in Singapore?
Yeah, it's not so easy to grow chickens here. There's a limit to how many pet chickens you can have, and there's also the land constraint issue. So farming's not really a thing here.
Right. For me, I started to learn a language. I think a lot of people did that. I jumped onto Duolingo and picked up Spanish, and my streak is ongoing. I think 1,600 days. So yeah, if we want to practice our Spanish later, we can do. It's time for our weekly quiz. Liling, are you ready? It's your favorite time of the episode, I know. The question this week is COVID related. Which city in the world spent the most days under lockdown during the pandemic?
Cumulative or continually?
You can give me either. I know the answer to both. If you have both, you get double points this week.
Okay, this is not easy. Let me have a guess. But you know, Jack, your quizzes are like anglerfishes. You dangle these really obvious, bright, shiny lures. And then when the responses are offered, you devour them and then spit them out without compunction. So yeah, I'm going to be careful with this one.
Sometimes the obvious answers are correct. We'll find out at the end of the podcast. Okay, it's news time. Liling, what's caught your eye in the newsroom this week?
You know how we keep hearing that 2023 was the hottest year on record? Well, this year's not getting better. Surprise, surprise. A new report says the world in the last 12 months clocked, on average, 26 more days of extreme heat. That's nearly an extra 4 weeks of very hot days that the study says probably wouldn't have happened if not for climate change. The report is by a group that includes the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. It says, while extreme heat is known to have killed tens of thousands of people over this period, the real number is likely in the hundreds of thousands or even millions. That's because, unlike sudden onset weather disasters, heat waves kill more slowly and less obviously, and they make pre-existing medical conditions even worse. So they hit vulnerable groups the hardest: children, elderly, the poor, and people who have to work outdoors. Now, there is an ongoing extreme heat wave now in Asia, across Bangladesh, Malaysia, Myanmar, Nepal, and the Philippines. So yeah, it's going to hurt.
Yeah, and I just saw that India is being hit by really extreme weather as well. 52.3 degrees in Delhi, I think. Just insane numbers that we're seeing. And it feels like we're talking about heat, if not every week, every second week.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
No, I think we have to get used to it. Yeah. Going back to what's making headlines this week, it's been a brutal few weeks as people were reeling over the Singapore Airlines turbulence incident that caused multiple casualties. News came of the landslides in Papua New Guinea's Enggak province, where more than 2,000 people are believed dead. Both of these events have raised even more red flags about the havoc climate change is already causing. Now, there is contention about how much of what happened in Papua New Guinea had to do with a recent earthquake, gold mining, or extraordinary rainfall that's been linked to climate change. But this is a country on the front lines of climate change, as we know, already prone to very wet weather. And research suggests that shifting rainfall patterns linked to global warming could increase the risk of landslides. So there you have it, the news this week from your resident bearer of bad news.
Yep, more bad news from you, Liling, again, bringing us all these stories of damage. But that's climate change a lot of
I'll
the
try
time.
to be a little bit more delightful.
Let's go to the pandemic now. It's our main story this week. It was back in June 2020 when I was confined to my home office in Bangkok, and I wrote a story called Greener and Cleaner, Reimagining Our Cities in the Wake of COVID-19. The concept was to speak to leading urban planning and design experts around the region in Singapore, Bangkok, Manila, Kuala Lumpur, and Jakarta for their ideas and aspirations for greener, more equitable, and resilient cities once the coronavirus challenge was overcome. And then we listed some of their suggestions that they hoped would be prioritized as learnings from the really hugely disruptive events that made our cities totally grind to a halt.
And so looking back through the article, the ideas were really varied in ways they're unique to the location, the challenges of those particular cities themselves. But then if you look at them broadly, these are improvements that any city could look at. In Jakarta, calls for car-free neighborhoods and upgraded waterfront areas. In Bangkok, a more livable and walkable city with green public spaces. And in Kuala Lumpur, decongesting the city centre and sustainable, affordable housing. And then Manila, focusing on emissions and helping and housing the underserved members of the community.
All right, we'll get to Singapore in a minute, but for some of these capitals where we're not living, who better than our correspondents there to give us some of their observations of what's happened actually since the pandemic. First up, it's Nivel Reda, my colleague in Indonesia.
During the pandemic, particularly when the activity restrictions were still in full swing, there were two things, essentially, which were notably absent from Jakarta. One is crippling traffic, and the other is air pollution. Now, of course, everybody welcomed this, and over the years, the Jakarta government have introduced a series of initiatives, just to keep the momentum going. And one of these initiatives were more bike lanes. As restrictions were eased, we started to see more and more people, trying to keep fit by cycling to work. Jakarta also tried to impose a no-car zone, particularly in popular tourist areas. And they also tried to impose higher parking fees for vehicles which fail the emission test requirements. But after a few years, these efforts appeared to lose steam. There was a lot of resistance, for example, to the creation of bike lanes, particularly from people who are just, used to driving everywhere they go, So instead of sticking their guns, make a few adjustments here and there, they just gave up, basically. So there has been inconsistencies in enforcing these policies, which makes traffic gridlocks and air pollution return to the level they were, if not worse, than before the pandemic. Reinvigorating the waterfront was certainly a novel idea, and that was one of the campaign promises of the last Jakarta governor, Anies Baswedan. But, it's easier said than done, I guess. You cannot reinvigorate the waterfront if the rivers keep flooding, if the rivers reek the smell of industrial, chemical, and domestic waste, And these things require cooperation between the city and the surrounding suburbs where all of these rivers originate.
So interesting to hear from Nivel there that there really were good ideas, but the government has struggled to keep up the momentum. And there are always obstacles to making changes to the way cities work. And maybe as a resident there, it's frustrating to see projects start and then stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of these cities too, we hear about this waterfront, water management, flooding rivers. I think a lot of cities that are near bodies of water or near open seas really have to struggle with how they manage coastal degradation and the effects of rising sea levels as well. And I think this is something that's quite prevalent, especially for these cities on the front lines of climate change.
Yeah, that's a big challenge for Jakarta. You can imagine the potential, just like in Bangkok, of being able to use and utilize all these waterways. We might see in developed cities around the world that where waterfronts become really premium assets for cities and for residents, but we still struggle with many issues related to water in this region. Okay, let's look at Malaysia. And I spoke to our colleague there, Rashvin Bedi.
So during the pandemic, Kuala Lumpur and many parts of Malaysia did see some temporary improvements in air quality and even water quality during the lockdowns. Of course, these were due to a decrease in traffic and industrial activity, which then lessened the pollution. But these changes were short-lived once restrictions eased and economic activity resumed. I believe that we are now back to square one and that things are just like how they were before the pandemic. You can see roads congested again. Even something like work from home. More employers are making it mandatory for the employees to return back physically to office every day. And this, of course, contributes to congestion on the roads and subsequently pollution levels go up. The pandemic, I think, highlighted the impact human activity had on the environment and could have served as a springboard to implement more sustainable practices in the long run. Things such as using public transport, but we see that the number of vehicles being registered are increasing every year to record levels. I believe this is more to do with attitudes of people.
At the height of the pandemic, or at least as we were well in the thick of it, pictures started emerging of these city centres that had been taken over by flora and fauna. You have pictures of, they were monkeys and peacocks and just roaming the streets where once vehicles plied. And it was jarring, it was almost apocalyptic. And I think it really raised the question of how much more we need to think about how we're encroaching on nature and how we can better coexist with it, I think.
It's a pretty warped idea for us as well to say, oh, animals in our city.
I know.
How strange. What's happening here? And it also shows that nature doesn't need much to really bounce back really quickly. Let me focus a little bit then on Bangkok. I was here, obviously, throughout the pandemic. And right now, the city and the whole country is on a pretty intense tourism drive. There's this ambition of reaching and beating pre-pandemic heights. So the government's target now is to have 40 million foreign arrivals for this year, which would be revenue of about 95 billion US dollars.
40.
You can just imagine 40 million foreign arrivals. And this type of tourism and then all the growth that comes with it typically comes at a cost. And the question is whether you can be a greener and cleaner country and city and have a larger carrying capacity while at the same time having a lesser footprint on the planet. And I think the answer to that lies in whether the Thai government's national strategy called the biocircular green economy model ends up being successful. So basically they're trying to reduce resource consumption, reduce pollution and the environmental impact while at the same time driving economic growth, of course, never ends. And within Bangkok, more specifically, there has been a much more concerted green agenda that I've noticed and we've reported about. The governor here has often prioritized making the city cleaner and more functional. And you can start to see some of those impacts slowly unfolding. We have cleaner canals, for instance. There's less flooding of roads during the wet season, although that'll be tested again over the next few months. Better access to public parks and green spaces. My gripe is that still many of them not friendly for dogs, which is annoying for me taking my very active Labrador for a walk. Yeah, and more urban tree canopy as well. There's a massive new shopping centre right near my place, just what Bangkok needed.
Another shopping mall.
Yeah, but as part of it, they have developed sort of park areas around it and planted greenery on the roadside and the SkyTrain station nearby. And they're only just small things, but in a world of concrete, it actually does seem to make a difference. And then one major initiative is to bury all those crazy tangles of overhead cables. I'm sure you've seen them when you've come to cities like Bangkok, like an impossible knot of years of various cables. And then there was this backlash on social media about it. All these tourists saying, oh no, the iconic imagery of Bangkok will be lost forever. The city won't feel like it used to. And then you have all these locals going, excuse me, this is an eyesore. It's getting in the way. It's blocking trees. It's a nightmare to live with.
Here. Yeah, you don't have to live here. We do.
Yeah, totally. So, Liling, what about Singapore? The ideas from the experts were redefining density, healthier transport options, smarter schooling. Do these concepts strike a chord with you? And then maybe talk us through how you've seen Singapore redefine itself post-pandemic.
Well, I wasn't here in Singapore during the pandemic, so I'm not really in the position to compare then and now. But looking at the bigger picture about Singapore's sustainable urban development, a lot of the efforts that they're doing, they do strike a chord. Now, it's redefining density by dispersing activity in the city centre closer to the outskirts, by developing a second central business district out further in the heartlands towards the west. It's called Jurong Lake District, and this is one example. This development will basically decentralize human and vehicular congestion. It mixes residential buildings with commercial and business buildings, and this is touted as a sustainable district where people can live, work, and play without having to venture very far. And that jives with me because it really moves all that traffic intensity away from what's now the Orchard Central Business District area. It's also doing a lot with transportation. One of the comparisons I often make is how the subway system here is so much more efficient, clean, and safe than in New York City, which is almost as old as when it was first built. And Singapore is in the process of expanding its public transport systems reach further to the outskirts of the city, and that means more people will be using public transport. Fewer of them will be using cars. There are also going to be more pedestrian-friendly streets that are coming up that are off-limit to cars as well. I don't know if you've been to Singapore recently, Jack. We have several ecological links, so that connects forested areas, green conservation areas that would otherwise be separated by highways. So that means pangolins, your Raffles banded langurs, they can cross these highways without becoming roadkill.
Good idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, you love animals, so that's great for the animals here, for our native wildlife. So there is a lot to talk about when it comes to Singapore's efforts to incorporate sustainability into its development plans.
Let's talk generally about why cities are so important in the climate fight. And basically, there are two main points to think about. There's populations and there's pollution. So more than half of the global population currently live in cities. Not really surprising. But by mid-century, it's expected that 2.5 billion more people will be settled in cities. The vast majority of that movement of people will be in Asia and in Africa, by the way. So urban land areas are expanding fast, and they're a major driver of resource extraction and use as a result. And the cities also produce about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, not so surprising given it's where business and industry invariably happens. So you drop these elements into a bowl, you mix it up, and we get climate-driven impacts. A big one is heat. We've spoken so much about it. And then there's disease, biodiversity affected, food and water, etc. So having said all that, it's clear that cities are part of the problem. They also have to be part of the solution in combating climate change. And that needs money.
Right, but they're not getting what they need. In fact, far from it. A report released at the Global Climate Talks in Dubai last year at COP28 found that cities still receive only 1%, Jack, of the climate finance that they need. And that can be as high as a whopping $5.4 trillion a year. In March, city mayors from around the world who are part of the C40 network called for multilateral development banks, think the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank, for example. They're calling for them to include urban climate action and finance in their corporate and climate strategies.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that Singapore has just played host to the World City Summit there.
Yeah, that's right. And another important point about sustainable cities is to make them livable cities, so more inclusive. In a lot of cities here in Asia, they're facing a rapidly aging population. So there is a lot of interest in making these cities more accessible to them so they don't live in isolation, that they can interact with their community. It's also about making it accessible to people with disabilities as well. So when we hear governments and city mayors talk about sustainable city, it's not just about reducing the carbon footprint and about climate change. It's just really broadly making them more livable and more sustainable in the long run.
Okay, it's quiz time. Repeating the question for you. Which city in the world spent the most days under lockdown during the pandemic? Liling, what have you got?
So I think the obvious answer might be China, might be Wuhan. That's a wild guess. But I don't think that they were locked down continuously for that long. Cumulatively, it's either Sydney or Melbourne.
Stand by. Just checking
Continuously.
Wuhan. Okay, so Wuhan, from what I have researched, had a 76-day lockdown. Sydney and Melbourne, the people from Sydney will be cursing at you through their phones. It was Melbourne. Melbourne had 277 days of lockdown. And having friends and family there, that was such a tough time for them. The longest consecutive lockdown was actually Buenos Aires in Argentina. They were 234 consecutive days lockdown.
Wow.
Extreme.
Do people know that? Is that general knowledge? Did you know that, Sai? I'm asking.
I was thinking China.
Oh, yeah.
I knew it would be Melbourne. I knew it. But I didn't expect I didn't know about Buenos Aires. Yeah.
I didn't know about Buenos Aires either.
All right, that's it for Climate Conversations this week.
Thank you all for joining us and sharing us with your climate inquisitive friends. And do come back every Thursday for new episodes. I'm Liling Tan.
And I'm Jack Board. Hasta luego.
Adios.